Hello, and welcome to our very first podcast episode of From the Pastor's Bookshelf. And I am here with Pastor Jeremy Carmichael. And this guy, he devours books the way Cookie Monster devours cookies. And so we are really excited to bring this podcast to you. Jeremy, why don't you tell them, spend a couple minutes talking about what this podcast is and what we're doing here.
Yeah, well, I'd like to read books, devour books like Cookie Monster devours cookies, but I do love books.
Without destroying them.
Yeah, no.
He just destroys the cookies.
Yeah, yeah, I don't destroy them. They're intact afterwards. But no, I've always loved books. My father was a guy who loved books and is still a man who loves books. And so I get actually pleasure out of just buying books and new things you can read. And the purpose of the whole podcast is our imagination is shaped by what we consume. And oftentimes we're consumed with all kinds of crazy things, right? And it's not necessarily edifying, not necessarily helpful. And so the main kind of literature we want to have our minds and our imaginations flooded with is the Bible, of course. We want to have daily in God's revealed will, or His Word revealed to us, revealing Himself to us. But besides the Bible, what are we allowing in? And so the whole idea of this podcast is forming our imagination with good literature. And so we're going to look at all kinds of different books, classic works of fiction, various didactic or, nonfiction type books that teach us something. So old, new, all different types. And so that's the whole idea of the podcast, is to inspire us to maybe read a few more books. If you don't read books at all, then maybe this podcast has inspired you to read a book that you'd never thought about reading. And at the end of the year, after 12 months, it'd be great if some members of our congregation or anyone listening to this read. Because again, what we fill our imagination with forms our actions, forms our sense of understanding about who we are and how we relate to the world. And so let's fill it with some good literature as opposed to so much of the produced junk that often fills our minds. So that's the whole idea of this, is to have some good discussion about good books, and also to hopefully inspire people to read some good stuff as well.
Good. Yeah, I think we've largely lost the just sort of the literary aspect of our society, largely because of what we're going to be talking about today. So with that, let's talk about what threatens our ability to read so often.
Sure.
And let's dive into our first book.
Yeah. So the first book that we're going to be looking at here is 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You. 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You by Tony Reinke. And it's a book that talks about, hey, guess what? Your smartphone, right? That's what it's all about. And the smartphone is an interesting invention. It's an interesting bit of technology. It's been called the most powerful handheld tool of social connection ever invented. Think about it. It's not that the phone itself is so amazing, but it's what our phone connects us to and the ease in which we're connected to all kinds of things. And so the cell phone, the reason why it has such an influence on us is because it connects us to news, to music, to our schedules, to people, to videos. Anything I'm curious about, my phone will connect me to.
Yeah.
Whereas, go ahead.
Oh yeah, even just thinking about what the phone has replaced. Remember back in if you watch Back to the Future Part 2, right? They thought that fax machines were going to be ubiquitous; they were going to be everywhere.
Yeah, in 2015.
Remember exactly? Yeah. That came and went. Or I remember seeing an ad for the future airplane, what it was going to look like in the year 2000. The future airplane was going to have a fax machine in every seat. And just to think about, the Rolodex, the calendar, the journal, the Palm Pilot, everything that it's replaced, that's all been very handily and many times very helpfully condensed into something that is taken up by entirely screen, really.
Yeah.
And so that we can keep in our pocket. And the endless information that it connects us to through the internet, of course.
Yeah, and it connects us to one another in a way that we never thought possible, that seemed just sci-fi, and it connects us to all kinds of things. And but the thing that's because of that, because it connects us to all these things that matter to us, we're with our phones all the time. Studies show that once every 4.3 minutes, we're checking our phone.
Wow.
Once every 4.3 minutes, we're looking at our phone, all of our waking hours, so the 4.3 every 4.3 minutes of our waking lives. And so it's something it's something that connects us everywhere, and it's something we can take everywhere. A lot of the technologies that this replaced are things that you could not take with you, like you mentioned the fax machine. Back in the day, you're not going to take the fax machine with you to the baseball game, right, or to the movies, or even to the bathroom or whatever. You're not going to take it. But here with the phones, you take them everywhere. And one of the things that Reinke talks about is how technology is always changing us. Technology is not neutral. Technology is not something that simply forms a function or performs a function, rather, in our lives. Technology does that, but a lot of times we think of technology as only that. It's neutral. I have aims, I have goals, I have things I want to accomplish in life, and these various technologies that I get to have help me do that, help me do what I want to do. And we think that's it. Okay, the technology comes, it helps me do what I want to do, and then I'm done with it. But the technology itself also transforms us. It shapes us in ways that are quite revealing. And so Neil Postman, in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is a book we'd like to talk about on this podcast at some point, so I'll be brief here, but he talks about how even the technology as simple as a clock or a telegraph, changed society, changed civilization. That's anything you can do and introduce into the world, and it was actually transform civilization and also transform the way people see themselves and see other people. That's an amazing thing. So he goes in his book to talk about how the telegraph and the clock, just the clock did that. And if that's true, and you can look back in history and see how that's true, you can see how the clock transformed civilization and individuals' sense of being. You can see how the telegraph did that. You can see how all kinds of different kinds of technologies did not just serve a function, but transformed the way we see the world and how we interact in the world. It's not without effect. And so you can look back and see that. And so it behooves us to look at this technology. If a telegraph transformed the world and people's sense of being, how much more would a phone that I take everywhere and connects me to just about everything change me? And so that's the whole point of the book. That's really the whole point of the book that Reinke is getting at, is to ask some good questions about, since this technology is with me all the time, how is it changing me?
Yeah, that's good. I remember just recently hearing on the point of technology, David Thoreau, who spent months and months in the woods trying to escape from the technology of the day, long before the digital world. And he was very critical of the railroad system, the transcontinental railroad system that they were installing, because the railroad system was bringing news much faster than we'd ever seen it before. And so people were being inundated by news that was happening across the country or around the world through the telegraph. And he was saying that people were getting news faster than they could consume it. And it was, in his view, it was very harmful to society. And so if he could only see us now, I can't imagine what he would have to say. But I think that we often think of our smartphones as a tool, right? Even mentioning, something like the Rolodex, calendar, fax machine. We think about it on sort of the same playing field or even more base, like a hammer, right? A hammer exists. It's a tool. You go, you get it, and all it does is help you hit a nail. That's all it does. And then you put it down. But our phones are not like that. We don't put our phones down typically. We bring them with us. And so it's not a neutral tool like a hammer or a nail or something that just helps us accomplish our purposes or the things that we want to do, help us be more productive. Instead, it does help us do stuff, and it does stuff to us as well, right? The things that we do something to us. And so that's maybe no more true in any area, any sphere of life than it is in our digital lives with our phones.
So, you're absolutely right that because of that truth, then the whole point of discipleship, or how can we, as we seek to honor God with our lives and be a disciple of Jesus, it behooves us to take a hard look on how the different things in our lives are affecting us. And that's the big question that he asks in this book. It's not just a book about cell phones changing us. It's specifically how do smartphones affect the disciple of Jesus. right? Because our number one aim and our number one goal is to love God and to love people better, right? We want to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our mind, with all our soul, and with all our strength. And we want to love people as and love our neighbors as ourselves. And how are we doing at that? And more specifically, how is our smartphone impacting our ability to do that? Specifically, he kind of looks at it in these two different ways. How is our phones changing our sense of identity? And how are our phones changing our sense of purpose on the earth? Man, that's no more fundamental than that. And our identity is found in loving God and being loved by God, and our purpose is found in loving God and loving people, right? And so he puts it this way. He says, Jesus boils down the purpose and aim of our lives into two goals. Treasure God with your whole being, and then pour out your God-centered joy in love for others. On these two commands, all other smartphone laws depend, right? So rather than just diving into all the different ways that our phones may be impacting us, he tries to really boil it down to how does it impact the way that we love God and love people.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I like what he says on page 20 in the introduction. He says it this way, and this is just a great diagnostic question as we're thinking about all of this, specifically in terms of application. He says, what is the best use of my smartphone in the flourishing of my life? And obviously that extends not to just how can I better use my smartphone while I'm looking at it to cause my flourishing and help me in my life, but what habits around our smartphones do we need to establish so that we can flourish in our lives in the way that we love God and love other people?
Yeah. So what he does in the book then is that he wants to guide us as disciples of Christ to ask some good questions. And also, one other thing I think is worth noting before we get into the various questions that he asks is, man, we tend to there's all throughout the centuries, Christians have experienced new technologies coming in and have been threatened by them because technologies always impact how we see ourselves and the world around us and people. It's impossible for it not to, as we've said. They've reacted to it in a variety of ways. And there's a couple different approaches. One is to embrace it fully and pretend like it has no impact or it doesn't matter. And that's not a good way to go about it. Or it's to be very phobic of it and to be fearful and say, just throw it away. Let's get it out. No cell phone for me. Throw it in the trash. But really, and one of the things I love that Reinke does in his book here is that he allows our cell phone to be a window into our soul. It shows what and how our cell phone, our smartphones are, what they're revealing about who we are. What they're revealing, put another way, how we love God and how we love people. Yeah. It's a window. It reveals that to us. And so I encourage Christians to not be afraid of their phone, but to be able to ask some real honest and good questions to see what your phone is teaching you about who you are. Now, he puts it this way. He says that technology is always an extension of the self. Marshall McLuhan famously said that, the fork is not just a fork, it's an extension of my hand, right? And he says it this way about the phone. He says, my smartphone, my phone screen divulges in razor-sharp pixels what my heart really wants. This means that whatever happens on my smartphone, especially under the guise of anonymity, is the true expose of my heart, reflected in full color pixels back into my eyes. This is why we have passcodes, even says, because we're trying to protect people from gazing at our soul. Don't look at what I'm looking at. I don't want you to see all my screen time habits and all that sort of thing. And so because that's true, rather than just be afraid of that, again, is to go, all right, Lord, show me. We are, as a disciple, we always want, right? We want to know. We want to love God more, and we want to love people. We want to be more in harmony with the Spirit of God. And whenever there's an opportunity to see what's really going on, we should relish that. And our phones are that. Yeah. And so that's the nature behind these questions, is to do some self-discovery. Yeah, that's not good. To just learn about why phones are bad. If that's not what this podcast is about, that's not what this book's about. Cell phones, smartphones, whatever, bad juju.
Yeah.
Stay away.
Yeah, we're not the Luddites just trying to destroy the machines like during the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that, and I think not just even for self-evaluation, but even accountability of other people as well, right? I think our phones can be powerful tools for accountability, and we don't even like to talk about that, partially because our phones are so individualistic. I think even though it's all consuming, it sort of becomes a sphere of our lives that we don't want other people to comment on, right? If you want to clear out a room, just start asking people to show you their screen time. Hey, what apps have you been spending time on? How much time did you spend on Facebook this week? And see how well that goes for you. But even as disciples, not just ourselves trying to grow in the Lord, but even as we're helping other people, as we are iron sharpening iron, keeping each other accountable with our smartphone habits and using those as windows into some of the idolatries and some of the things of both ourselves and other people as well. So I think be a helpful thing.
I'm convinced that if Jesus always used good illustrations, right, to try to do what? To try to help us understand truth. And so he would use things that people could understand to reveal some things. And I'm convinced that if he were doing his teaching today, he would use smartphones as an illustration because they are so revealing. They are so revealing.
That's
so that said, the bulk of the book is broken up into 12 chapters where Reinke just describes 12 ways our phone is changing us. And we don't have time in this podcast to discuss all of them, but I do want to begin by reading just the 12 of them, just to throw that out there. And then we're going to focus on a few of them. So I'll just read them one by one. First is, we are addicted to distraction. Second, we ignore our flesh and blood. 3, we crave immediate approval. 4, we lose our literacy. 5, we feed on the produced. 6, we become like what we like, in the Facebook sense. 7, we get lonely. 8, we get comfortable in secret vices. 9, we lose meaning. 10, we fear missing out. 11, we become harsh to one another. 12, we lose our place in time. So lots to talk about there, but I want to first start with the first one he focuses on, which is we are addicted to distraction.
Yeah, and part of the reason why we're not diving into every chapter is because the goal is not just to tell you what the book is, right? The goal is to get you to read the book. And so if anything, we just want to whet your appetite for the content of the book. And so we'll just dive into a couple of these things and how they apply to us, and then let you read the rest.
Good. So we are addicted to distraction. Studies show that the more addicted we are to our phones, the more depressed, anxious, and anxious we are. Also, we tend to concentrate less at work and get less sleep at night. And so the distraction of our phones, where it's an addiction. It's a full-on addiction where but we're not just addicted to the phone, but to the distraction the phone can be.
Right.
And so there's 3 things that he says that digital distractions keep us away from. Because a distraction is just that, right? A distraction is something that keeps you away from something else, right?
Yeah.
So how are our phones doing that, and why do we want that? Well, one, he says, we use digital distractions to keep work away, right? So again, the unique thing about the phone is that it's a distraction that didn't exist before.
Yeah.
But our hearts, longing for that distraction, now have a device that facilitates that desire. And so in this, what happens with digital distractions keeping work away is that when life gets demanding, we crave something else.
Yeah.
When life gets hard. And there's all kinds of things. I mean, I always tell my kids that anything worth your time is going to have aspects of it that are wonderful, delightful, and grueling, right? It's work, right? So anything that's going to be productive, anything worth doing is going to have aspects of it that are just hard. It's hard. Work is hard and wonderful if it's good work. And so when life gets demanding, when responsibility begins to weigh on you, you crave something else, anything else. And our phones give us a wide variety of things to distract us.
Yeah.
I mean, an almost seemingly infinite variety of things to distract us, because it's not just, that's one of the things that's so wild about these phones, man, is that it's not, you might say, like someone who's addicted to their phones because it gives them a gaming opportunity. They're entertained by games. You might be someone who goes, I don't do games. That's not an issue for me. I'm not one of those people or whatever. Yeah, those peasants. You might not be that person, but you might. But the phone does more than games. It gives you a distraction to news. If you're someone who tends to be, really, I want to know what's going on in the world. Well, your phone, you used to have to wait for the paper to come in the morning.
Right.
Now you can get it right now. As we've been talking, there's news that has come that we're missing out on, man.
Yeah. I've got my phone right here.
Oh, yeah, you can check it, yeah. Things that are helpful. Things that you go, I'd like to know how to fix a transmission on my car or whatever. You can get distracted by that, or just curiosities, or it could be just trivial stuff. I'll just be honest with myself, or with y'all, is that I've never been like the clickbait guy. Like, what happened there? Oh, what happened there?
You're never gonna believe this.
Yeah, that was never a distraction for me. So when I first started reading this, like, we're addicted to distractions, like, well. Yeah, I don't like to be distracted
Those
that way.
people are.
But but then we started talking about you can be addicted to trivial stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, oh boy, because I'm curious about. I'm a curious person. I get curious about things, and ever since I've had my smartphone, I delight in the fact that any curiosity I have, I can find the answer to it.
Yeah.
It used to be hard. You had to go. I mean, there's some questions that I have or would have, and I realize I can never get to the answer to that.
Right.
I could never, unless I went and met, say it's
knowledge.
about like a person that is interesting to me. I'm not going to get that information. I have to meet them or happen to see them on the Carson show or something, going way back, right?
How old are you?
You go, I have to, oh, yeah, look, they're going to talk. Anyways, but now, if you have that question right now, you can just find it. And so that's because I'm a curious guy. I do that all the time. And so but those distractions of all kinds of varieties, and we just named a few here, are things that keep us away from having to do the grueling work.
I think I recently saw a video on Facebook, of course, but it was a psychologist talking about smartphone addiction, and he was saying that if you go into the workplace, like a place with a bunch of cubicles, it's really interesting evaluating the way different generations interact with their phones during work hours, right? And so he said, for example, often older generations, they still have a phone, and it's usually on the desk off to the side, kind of like ours are now, right? And they would be working, and then they might get a notification, they work a little bit more, and then, periodically they might pick it up, check it, do something. And he said, but the younger people, millennials and Gen Z below them, he says they always have their phone in between their hands while they're typing on their keyboard.
Interesting.
And so they're typing,
they can just get right to it.
And then they work. And so he was talking about just the addictive nature of smartphones, but even over generations, the generation that has grown up with it, they literally can't live without it. It has to be the central aspect of what draws their attention in, even during working hours. They're on the clock. They're getting paid for those hours, data entry or whatever it is they're doing. And they have to be there. And so often, whether it's games, whether it's information, and I'm the same way. I love information, and I love having access to endless information. I can at any given time. Yeah, at any given time, I was testing this out earlier today. If you type in, there's certain things you can look at on Google, and you can get 25 billion results on Google in 0.5 seconds to just about anything you search for. 25 billion results. And so any question that you have, you can get answered to some degree. And so, whether it's information or games or even communication, oftentimes we trick ourselves into thinking, oh, it's because I'm seeing what my friends are doing on Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram. And so we trick ourselves into thinking that, oh, no, this is meaningful because it's fostering relationship, as we'll get into a little bit later, talking about how it actually doesn't foster a relationship. But I love what Reinke says on page 191. He talks about how certainly our smartphones, they sort of give way to embarrassing sins or a variety of different vices. But he says one of the most debilitating things in the nature of distraction is that we give ourselves over to what he calls routines of nothingness. Routines of nothingness. And so whether it's a game, whether it's useless information or even important information, it's often a lot less important than we think it is, right? And so we give ourselves over to these things, and that shapes us and changes us and distracts us.
Yeah, and he quotes from C.S. Lewis, where C.S. Lewis talks about in the Screwtape Letters, where that one of the ways that the enemy, the devil, distracts us, or not distract, one of the tactics of the enemy is nothing, what's called the nothing strategy, and that's on that page actually, 191. I see it here as well.
Cool.
I had it bookmarked, but. Page 191, where he says, what I am coming to understand is that the impulse to pull the lever of a random slot machine of viral content is the age-old tactic of Satan. C.S. Lewis called it the nothing strategy in his Screwtape Letters. It is the strategy that eventually leaves a man at the end of his life looking back in lament. I now see, he says, that I spent most of my life in doing neither what I ought nor what I liked. This nothing strategy is very strong enough to steal away a man's best years, not in sweet sins, but in a dreary flickering of the mind over it knows not what and knows not why, in the gratification of curiosity so feeble that the man is only half aware of them, or in the long dim labyrinth of reveries that have not even lust or ambition to give them a relish, but which once chance association has started them, the creature is too weak and fuddled to shake off. He goes on to say how Satan's nothing strategy aims at feeding us endlessly scrolling words, images, and videos that dull our affections, instead of invigorating our joy and preparing us to give ourselves in love.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember specifically in the Screwtape Letters, it's probably the same chapter, same letter that he's talking about, but there's a subject, Screwtape's talking to Wormwood about this particular subject that Screwtape had worked on long ago, and he was a devout atheist his whole life, and he talks about this one particular time where he was right on the brink of belief, this subject, and he was in an art museum staring at just a beautiful painting and just being confronted with really the reality of beauty and saying, why do I find this beautiful? Where does this come from? And it said instead of Screwtape coming at him with a vicious attack or making himself visible or some horrible lust or vice, something like that, instead what he did was he gave him just a small pang of physical hunger. And so he was pulled out of this self-evaluation and right on the brink of belief. Yeah. And he said, and then I thought, the subject says, and then I thought to myself, I haven't had a sandwich yet. And the thought left, and he remained an atheist the rest of his life because of that. And so just those small distractions, whatever they are, can often stop us, and our phones are better than anything else, stopping us from really asking the big questions that God wants us to ask.
Yeah. Yeah, and so so the first thing he mentions is that how it keeps us away from work. Right. So enduring through and doing that which is difficult. And I think the question for the disciple in that moment is, doing what we want versus what we ought. Yeah. There's lots of times that we ought to do things that are hard, but we have an option to do something that we just want to do. And that keeps us away from doing the work that is necessary to be productive in life. Yeah. And the second thing he mentions is that we use digital distractions to keep people away. In the digital age, he says, in the digital age, we are especially slow to associate with the lowly around us. Instead, we retreat into our phones, projecting our scorn for complex situations or for boring people. In both cases, when we grab our phones, we air our sense of superiority to others without knowing it. And what he means by that is that if you're in a group of people, and you're sitting in the waiting room at the dentist office or something. Used to be you sat next to a person, the idea was maybe I should talk to this person. But now what is everyone doing? They're doing this. Yeah. And when you're doing that, it creates a barrier between you and that other person. And so this distraction, because it's so compelling, we were drawn into that, and it keeps us from work, and it keeps us from people. It keeps us from engaging with the people that, as Christians, we've been called to, right? To be salt and light. But the distractions keeps us in our own little bubble, our own little digital bubble. And the third thing he mentions is that we use, and this is a heady sort of thought, but we use, and it taps into what you were mentioning about the painting with the Screwtape Letters, is we use digital distractions to keep thoughts of eternity away. Yeah. And this is huge in terms of how the distraction that's available to us through our phones keeps our thoughts of eternity away. And he says the human appetite for distraction is high in every age because distractions give us easy escape from the silence and solitude whereby we become acquainted with our finitude, our inescapable mortality, and the distance of God from all other desires, hopes, and pleasures. And to numb this emptiness, because the idea is if you're in solitude and you're really asking the hard questions, like he was with that painting, right? Asking the really serious and questions that all beings, all humans must ask, rather than allowing our hearts and minds to go there and grapple with some of these big decisions, we stay so on the surface. And instead, we can be distracted to learn, how a lightsaber was made. With the kyber crystals.
Sounds like a personal distraction.
So rather than asking those hard questions, those important questions, those things that really matter, we're actually numbed from the emptiness that compels us to ask those questions. There's an emptiness that we discover in our solitude. There's so what we do is to numb that emptiness. We turn to a powerful non-pharmaceutical antidepressant, as Reinke calls it. And so what happens is it rather, because we still have that emptiness and that need, and the philosophical maxim used to be, I think, therefore I am. Yeah. But he suggests, but that's been replaced, Reinke suggests, with the digital motto, I connect, therefore I am.
Interesting.
Which leads to the status desire about why do I have significance? I am liked, in the social media sense. Yeah. Therefore I am.
That's fascinating.
So, so it's not, again, it's not just a technology that helps us, right?
Yeah.
It's something that can distract us from answering the most important questions that one could ask.
I ran across this quote a couple weeks ago, and it's really stuck with me. It goes like this. This author, he says, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And you know who said that? It was Blaise Pascal. In the year 1670, he said that. What was there to distract people in 1670? Were they chasing sticks? Like, what did people do? And so, again, if he could see it, so, the issue of distraction has been with us forever. He says all of humanity's problems are because we can't sit quietly in a single room. And so distractions have been with us forever, but especially just the kind of ubiquitous nature of any not just distractions that happen to us from the outside, but distractions that we choose, right? This is sort of the first time in history that we've been able to choose whatever distraction we want to stop ourselves from, for example, the guilt that picks at our hearts, to stop ourselves from the boredom that forces us to ask hard questions, that forces us to ask eternal questions. And so we are masters of distraction, and the phone is a very easy lever to pull on to get whatever it is that we want to have.
Yeah, and that brings up a really good point that in helping us understand is it's not that our phones are evil. We're evil.
Yeah.
Right?
right.
So the distraction, the desire for distraction to avoid work, people, and asking the tough questions and really doing business with God has always existed.
Yeah.
And whether it was a stick that we could utilize for our pleasure, or any of distraction. The point is that about the smartphone is that it's far better than it's the most effective distraction.
Yes.
We've wanted. The problem is not the distraction. The problem is our desire for distraction.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's where, even as we're having this conversation, anyone who's listening to this is to be honest about your desire for distraction.
Yeah.
And how you're employing your phone to aid and abet that pursuit. Yeah. That's an important thing. And what happens, though, is as we do that more and more and more, these distractions interrupt what? Our sense of identity and our sense of what the telos, or our purpose, right? So there's our ability to love God and love people. It gets in the way. And I like what he says, Reinke says at one point. He says, my phone conditions me to be a passive observer. One of the things that's interesting about with these when you're distracted all the time, the unique thing about the phone is that you're not distracted to engagement. You're distracted to observe something at a far distance. Yeah. Right? And so you nurture this part of you that just becomes a passive observer. He says the more distracted we are digitally, the more displaced we are spiritually. So these distractions matter, and they greatly impact the way that we love God and love people. And there's a variety of ways that our smartphone does that, as we've talked about. Smartphone. Anyways, our smartphone does that. But specifically, one of the huge parts of smartphones is social media.
Yeah.
And not just the existence of social media, but our connection to it and the way that shapes our relationships, the way that shapes the way we see ourselves, and not just our self, but our digital self, and how we see our digital self and how that impacts the way we treat one another in the digital world, but also in the real world, our real world relationships. So one of the chapters is called "We Become What We Like." So when you're on Facebook or various social media things, you like different things that people say, right? And so we want to like certain things, but also we want to be liked. So we want the product that we put out there to be liked. For example, when we put this thing out there, I hope it gets liked, right? yeah.
That's right.
But that will obsess us. That plays a role in not just in giving us data on, that was a worthwhile thing that I shared. It gives me a sense of self. Mm-hmm. So what Reinke says is, we are not who we think we are. We are not even who others think we are. We are who we think others think we are. In other words, what we think other people think about us profoundly shapes our sense of identity and our search for belonging. So there's this guy who, because we caught up in that whole thing, obviously anyone who's ever been in social media can see how much that can consume you, right? Mm-hmm. We want approval, we desire to be liked, and it draws us in. But again, it's not just that we're drawn into this social media world. It impacts the way we have relationships with other people. Mm-hmm. People we care about. There's a graduate student that Reinke mentions that did an experiment. He says, no social media, no smartphone for a season of time. And after he had done that a good long while, his wife said this to them. She said, man, everything's changed. Everything's changed in the way that we relate. So his relationship with his wife was profoundly impacted just because he was engaged in social media, not doing anything negative.
Right.
So, obviously you could be negatively impacted by doing strange things on social media, but just the fact that he was engaged in social media, she said this, it was difficult to talk about deeper things that mattered, because you are constantly distracted by internet litter. You are now able to focus and give necessary attention to deeper issues. More of what we talk about comes from your heart rather than your Twitter feed.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's so fascinating how so much of our conversations with one another is just parroting something that we see online, whether it's political commentator or whether it's a funny meme or an article that we liked or found helpful or informative. So not even necessarily bad things, but just things that we just simply parrot and frankly, I think part of that is because we find those things more interesting than normal face-to-face conversations that are not informed by those things. And so we want other people to be interested by the same things we're interested in. Yeah. I remember hearing, I think it was on the John Tesh show. This is going back a little ways. I know you're a big John Tesh fan.
Yeah.
Big band jazz.
Yeah. So that when my Walkman, I always listen to John Tesh.
That's really, right. It's always on 103.3. Anyways, what he was saying was it was a study that he did between, or not he, but that he was quoting, that they did between married couples and the impact of social media on marriage conversations. And so oftentimes when you're married, one of the important parts of relational connection is just finding out how your spouse's day was. What'd you do? What was your high? What was your low? What were things that were hurtful? How can I pray for you? All of those conversations and questions are important. Yeah. And because of social media, what was happening was oftentimes when you get home, if your spouse or significant other has been updating their status, then you already know what their day was like. And so he was saying it was harming relationships because you wouldn't have anything to talk about anymore. And it wasn't just you who knew about those things. And so it wasn't even relationally building in the way it could have been because it's you and 1,000 other people who happen to know what your day was like and what you ate for lunch and how many peanuts were in your peanut butter and jelly or whatever it was. Yeah. And so it just one way that it threatens meaningful conversation.
The important stuff.
Yeah, that's right. Peanuts.
Well, that leads so because it impacts the real world relationships as opposed to the digital world relationships.
Yeah.
One of the things that happens is we get lonely.
Yeah.
That was one of the chapters. We get lonely. That's one of the ways our smartphones are shaping us is we get lonely. And actually, one of the big questions that people are asking is why, with such crazy connection through our smartphones, through the internet, in a hyper-connected digital age, why does such loneliness persist? And it's something that absolutely does, is that people feel more lonely in some respects than they ever did. And yet, we should be connected. We feel like it. But technology and isolation go hand in hand. Every technology has always been a way of isolating us or has helped us be isolated in some form or another, right? And cell phones smartphones are no difference. But one of the difference ways that it does that, let's take an example of like if you're a technology that allows you to plow a field with just one instrument as opposed to using a team of people that you had to deal with and work with and befriend and work together as a team. Now you can just do it by yourself. And now tractors that are just GPS driven, right? It doesn't even take anybody, right? So it is more and more isolating, and that really impacts how we see ourselves and how we impact and relate to other people. We see ourselves, the more we're drawn into the digital world through social media, we see our digital self, and we see ourselves as they appear on our cell phones.
Yeah.
We see ourselves in high def on a screen that's clean, but the real world is messy.
Yeah.
People are messy. Reinke says that everywhere a real person touches, they leave an oily smudge, a greasy smudge. That's the truth. That's just the way it is, and yet we feel like we can distance ourselves from that through social media, through this digital reality that we get to experiment with and do. And so we end up becoming lonely because the more we try to satisfy our sense of connection through that, we actually distance ourselves from people.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's so often we want to be the projection of ourself that we put forward on social media, right? And you see it obviously through things like online dating, but you see it through Facebook, Instagram, you see it everywhere, right? Why does Instagram have filters? Because people like the filtered version of themselves much more than they like the real version of themselves so often. Even kind of a funny cultural reference, but there's an episode of The Office, and you've seen where Dwight, one of the characters, he was playing this game called Second Life, and it's this whole idea of you create this digital version of yourself, and then you get to play around and do different things. And so you can be anybody, right? You could be a rock star, you could do whatever you want. And so, but what Dwight did was he perfectly recreated himself except for one small change. He could fly. And so he's just a normal paper salesman from this tiny town, except he would just take off and like fly all over the place.
Aimlessly throughout the city.
And so, but even that is just, it's a projection of yourself, right? And so, man, I wish I was exactly the same, except I could fly. That would be awesome.
On that same show, he had his Second Life character create his own Second Life character.
That's right.
So kept going deeper and deeper into that craziness.
Second Life Inception.
Well, Reinke mentions as that happens, right? Because what's interesting about that whole Second Life thing is you have this Second Life that is ideal in some ways, but it's completely separated from reality. And even in that, he even created another degree of separation there.
Right.
But there's this weird reversal that happens that Reinke mentions. There's a reversal where we want to be, on the one hand, we want to be more connected, but we end up being more isolated. And he puts it this way: the smartphone is causing a social reversal, the desire to be alone in public and never alone in seclusion.
Yeah, that's good.
We can be shielded in public and surrounded in isolation, meaning we can escape the awkwardness of human interaction on the street and the boredom of solitude in our homes, or so we think. So there's this place where we realize people are messy. People are awkward, and so or they potentially awkward. I mean, various interactions just can be awkward. But in the social media realm, it can be not that obviously social media can be quite awkward and uncomfortable, but you can escape it pretty easily. Right. Whereas if someone asked you a probing question in face to face, you have to answer it. You're stuck. You can't just. Whereas if someone sent you a text, you could get back to them like 4 days later if you wanted to,
or not at all if you
or
don't
not
want
at all.
to.
Yeah. So that creates so in a desire to avoid the awkward, we tried to dive into social media, and so you can be in public and be completely isolated, not interacting with any flesh and blood person. But then when you're completely alone, you feel connected, but none of it's real.
Yeah.
Because when you're with people, you're in the fake world, and when you're alone, you're not, embracing solitude, or you're not with people, but you're trying to feel connected. And so it creates a weird situation for folks.
I think you even notice that even in just physical posture. If you're walking through the mall or on an airplane, you see this notoriously. People with their headphones in and just completely crouched over their phones, right? Even just the curve of the back. It's off-putting in terms of relationship, right? And so if you're walking through the mall, there's not a lot of people who are on their phone that you think, I want to walk up and talk to them. They look like they're hungry for relationship. I'm going to go talk to them.
Yeah.
And so even the physical posture that being on our phone creates a sense of isolation, even if we're in a public space like a mall or coffee shop or something like
Isolated right in public.
Yeah. And so it's bizarre. And I think one of the kind of funny things is that when you see somebody who's not on their phone, we're so trained to just pull out our phones if there's any moment of boredom, if we're waiting for a coffee or drinking a coffee or whatever it is. That even when you see somebody who's not on their phone, it looks weird, right? You're not used to it. So there's this funny meme that I saw online, and it said something along the lines of, I went to Starbucks the other day and I saw a guy sitting there just drinking his coffee, no phone, no tablet, nothing. Like a psychopath. And it's so true, like picturing a coffee shop full of people on their phones except for one guy.
Just taking it all in.
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah.
Like, what is he planning? Is he okay? Why doesn't he have a phone?
Yeah. And, I think that isolates us in a couple different ways. One is that we avoid the real relationships and the awkwardness. Yeah, you do avoid some of the awkwardness, but you also avoid the benefit of that awkwardness. And Reinke puts it this way: he says, this is where the advantages of embodied awkwardness come into play. The most shaping conversations we need are full of friction, and we simply cannot have them on our frictionless phones. Or I would even go on to add that when friction does occur on social media, it's never resolved in a way that is pleasing. It's never resolved in a way that you can really do. You need to be face-to-face where you can see the affect of the person talking to you and whatnot. So I think it isolates us in that way, that we or the isolation impacts us in that we're not being shaped by one another in a way that the community of Christ is designed to shape us in ways that are good. So anyway, so we avoid those awkward situations that we need. And one of the ways that we're able to do that is if we're living our life in social media, if we're getting our sense of connectivity through that and that alone, not through, we're going to ignore people that need us, but also we're going to ignore all kinds of things that we need to hear to grow. And you see that show up in social media, just the way the algorithms are set up and whatnot, is what comes through on your feed is basically an echo chamber. It's people that agree with you, right? Or people that you become what you like. So all we're hearing and is people that or people who agree with our basic point of view.
Yeah.
And so our point of view is never challenged. And boy, do we need our point of view challenged. And what is another way that's what happens. And so the idea of someone coming in that's saying something that is displeasing to us or cuts against the grain of what we like, rather than actually working it out with that person and trying to grow together and to find either resolve or just to listen to another point of view, not in a relativistic way, but in a way that is courteous, kind, helpful, is that we actually, because we live so much of our life in social media, we lose the ability to disagree with one another.
Yeah.
How do you face-to-face actually disagree? And I think a big part of the way people treat one another in our culture these days that is just so impolite, so lacking in kindness and whatnot, is that we're not nurturing that part of us that has to listen to another person. Because on social media, you just stop, mute, move on, block, or whatever, and you don't have to endure through that. And that was never an option before.
Right.
You couldn't do that. You were in relation with people, and you had to work it out. Now we don't have to, and we get used to that, and it becomes easy to just and so relationship with one another ends up breaking down.
Yeah, I think that even things that, because I'll see a lot of things on my social media newsfeed that I disagree with, but it's always through the lens of something that I do agree with, right? It's somebody sharing something and going, isn't this terrible? Or it's, I'll hear a position that I disagree with spliced in with commentary that I do agree with, right? Breaking down a certain argument that I don't like or something like that, as opposed to actually hearing the argument out and having to do the reasoning work, the actual hard brain work of dissecting any given argument and letting it both, one, nuance my position, and two, strengthen my argument against whatever that argument is. And so we completely lose that if all we listen to is commentary breaking down the things that we don't like. So it's either something that I totally agree with or something I don't agree with through the filter of something that I do agree with. And so it becomes a vicious cycle.
And one of the reasons why one of the things, there's other things, but that's added to the polarization that we see is that. That very thing. So that actually is a good segue into the last section I want to look at here is how our phones are shaping us in the sense that how it aids and abets our sin. So not just our ability to love God and love people well. Obviously, not doing that well is sinful, but specifically, how does our phones shape us and give us an avenue to sin in a way that is easier than maybe it is in other situations? And one of them is what's called FOMO, the fear of missing out. One of the things that drives our interaction with our phone and the constant connection to our phones is fear of missing out. We are afraid we're going to miss that like on Facebook that we may have seen, that approval that we wanted. We're going to miss the new news story. We're going to miss and see what happened with those friends on Facebook, or we're going to miss out. We're fearful of missing out. And there's a real anxiety that exists in people being disconnected from the phone. We get so used to connected to anything and everything that if we don't have it, we're missing out. It is in 10 minutes or whatever it is. And what Reinke mentions about this in one of the chapter on this topic is that it's an ancient thing. It's an ancient tactic of the enemy to sabotage a relationship with God. It was what happened in the garden, right? Eve was tempted, and she had a fear of missing out. If I don't eat this fruit, I'm not going to get the things that I might otherwise have. And so she gave into that. And so think of it this way, disciples of Jesus. Every time you feel that pang in you of fear of missing out that guides you to your phone, you're responding to the same urge that drove Eve to the fruit.
Wow.
So it's not a neutral thing, as we've been talking about. And so that's one way, is that we're nurturing that part of us that I don't want to miss out, as opposed to doing something that would be life-giving or improving my relationship with the Lord, or and investing in other people in a real meaningful way.
Wow. That's good. So what are maybe are there any other vices other than just the fear of missing out, or any other sins that our smartphones can enable in us?
There's he has a whole chapter on the fact that we become comfortable in secret vices because of anonymity. We end up giving into all kinds of sins. One of those is pornography. Is a big, huge presence on the internet, of course.
It's the internet's biggest business.
It's so sad where there's. And so, and that's just one example. It's probably the prime example, but a variety of secret vices where it used to be that in order to engage in pornography, as an example, you had to be a certain age to even get it. You had to go to a store in like a seedy part of town or something, or I don't know. You had to go past all these barriers that would make you likely uncomfortable to apprehend it. And now all of those barriers are removed. All of those barriers are removed. And so because the availability of those things, it allows us to be trapped and actually find a comfort in secret vices.
One of the things he says on page 133, he says anonymity is where sin flourishes. And there's, again, to go back to the garden, there's a deep connection between sin and isolation, right? And so as soon as Adam and Eve sinned, what do? They hid. And God had to come and said, Adam, where are you hiding? And it's not because God didn't know where they were, right? He wasn't playing hide and seek, right? But he knew that they were isolating themselves for the first time ever because of the guilt and the shame and the sin and really the fear of missing out. that they gave into. And so, and in the same way, the anonymity that our smartphone gives us, that supposed wall of protection that we think we have, the instant access, it's just a love, intimacy, fake intimacy. It's just a click away. It's just a search item away. Yeah. And what's crazy about the smartphone, again, is it's not even something that we have to search for anymore. It gets delivered straight to our inbox when we don't want it to. We'll be surfing Instagram and an ad will pop up, and it's just right there. And so we need to be so careful when it comes to especially the issue of sexual purity online, because it's just such a monumental destructive force, even in the church.
Yeah. The percent, he lists some of the percentages. I don't have them right now in my mind, but they're quite high. And he listed it out by age, about how many people are having pornography be a regular part of their lives. And again, it's not the phone's not the problem. It creates access to allow our heart to do what it already wanted to do. And so you have to be very vigilant. And Jesus said, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body to be thrown into hell. And what Reinke says is it'd be better to throw out your cell phone, your smartphone, than to be you have your whole body thrown into hell. And so something to think about as you're, again, how is my phone shaping me? How to ask the honest question, how is my smartphone allowing me to engage in vices and sin in a way that people may not see, but God sees?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Another way that we sin is that we become harsh to one another. And obviously that exists on social media in a big time way. And one of the ways is slander. We end up slanderizing one another. And we think that if it's true, then it's okay to share. But the Bible is really clear on how we're supposed to engage with one another. And so if we see someone doing something that's wrong, we tend to not pay attention to Matthew 18, which says if someone sins against you, go to them. And there's a whole process that we're supposed to go to with one aim in mind: restore that relationship.
Yeah.
Or if someone does something that is out of bounds, and James says, do not speak evil against one another. The one who speaks against his brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There's only one lawgiver and judge, and he who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? And so there's this whole section in there about talking about how we so often engage in slander, which is a sin. Now, this means you don't speak out against injustice. That's actually a great tool that social media can be, is that if there's injustice going on, to be able to speak out and to speak truth into that situation. So in no way, he is not, nor am I advocating that we be blind to injustice, but the motive behind it is, are we trying to help, or are we trying to hurt?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think one good just sort of rubric that I try to run my Facebook comments through is on if it's responding to any given person, especially. I think, would I say what I'm about to say if I was sitting across the table from this person? If I took them out to coffee, am I willing to take them out to coffee to restore them? Right? Is this a sin that I want to confront to their face for the purpose of restoration? Yeah. Or does it feel good to say something? Yeah. Does it feel good to blast them? Does it make me feel better about myself to do that?
Yeah, good. Well, there's so much we could talk about with all this, and we could go on and on and on and on and on and on. Sure. It's a huge topic, which is why I think, get the book and read it and really do some self-assessment. What I want to close out with here is 2 lists of questions that he provides that we ask ourselves to see how we're doing in these areas. And the first one is right in line with what you were just saying. So there's 2 ways to think through how your phone is coming in and impacting you, or the content of your phone, but also what's going out. What are you putting out there? Yeah. And so this is in line with that. Before you say something in social media, ask these kinds of questions. Will this ultimately glorify me or God? Before you post anything, before you say anything, is this glorifying you or God? Will this stir or muffle healthy affections for Christ? Will this merely document that I know something that others don't? Will this misrepresent me, or is it authentic? Will this potentially breed jealousy in others? Will this fortify unity or stir up unnecessary division? Mm-hmm. Will this build up or tear down? Will this heap guilt or relieve it? Will this fuel lust for sin or warn against it? Will this overpromise and instill false hope in others? So some good questions to ask.
Yeah.
I think one of the big lessons with this whole book is that be mindful. This really, again, don't just pretend the phone is not shaping you or is not impacting the world around you, you and the way you love God and the way you love your people, your neighbors.
Yeah.
So those are some good questions to ask on that line. And then on another place, he talks about some things that we ought to think through in terms of our habits online, or our phone habits. And so there's 12 of them, so I'll just read them out loud. And if you want to comment on any of them, just speak up.
Sounds good.
All right. All right. Turn off all non-essential push notifications. Delete expired, non-essential, and time-wasting apps. At night, keep your phone out of the bedroom. Use a real alarm clock, not your phone alarm, to keep the phone out of your hands in the morning. Maybe you'd mentioned when we were talking before, not on the podcast, but kind of a 3-point rule about Bible before.
Yeah. There's it's a book. I forget the author's name, but the book is called The Common Rule, and it's built around the whole idea of sort of a system of habits that are healthy for the Christian to hold. And a couple of them related to just basic devotions, but a lot of them related to our habits in relation to our phones. And so a couple of things that he mentioned is one is when you wake up in the morning, go to Scripture before you go to your phone. Don't let your phone be the first thing that you grab in the morning. And I would add, don't let it be the last thing that you put down in the evening, right? There are far more meaningful things that we can be picking up than our phones. And so that was one of them. And then another one was turn off your phone or put it in a drawer, lock it, throw it in a lake, whatever, for at least an hour a day. Maybe not throw it in a lake, so you'd have to get it out. Yeah. But shut it off for an hour a day, just to spend 1 hour per day focusing on being present in your present moment. And then the third thing was, I believe it was around the whole idea of Sabbath and taking an extended period of time, a Sabbath day, whether it's once a week, even if it's a fast once a month, just to be completely away from your phone. Just leave it in the other room. Shut it off and just leave it there, right? The news cycle can be picked up tomorrow, and it'll be just as crazy tomorrow. Don't worry. You'll have plenty to be worried about tomorrow if you wait a day.
Guard your morning disciplines, another one he says, and evening sleep patterns by using your phone, setting the mute notifications between 1 hour before bedtime to a time when you can reasonably expect to be finished with digital or personal disciplines in the morning. So kind of what you were talking about there. Use self-restricting apps to limit your smartphone functions and the amount of time you invest in various platforms. Recognize that much of what you respond to quickly can wait. Yeah. Respond at a later, more convenient time. Even if you need to read emails on your smartphone, use strategic points during the day to respond to those emails. And he does like 9 and 4. That's just the only time he checks for emails is 9 and 4. Yeah. Invite your spouse, your friends, and your family members to offer feedback on your phone habits.
That doesn't sound fun.
Yeah, do it. But again, so the whole idea of all of this is to see how your phone may be shaping you.
Yeah.
And if you're serious about that, then if you want to love God better and to love your neighbor better, then it behooves us to do some of these things. When eating with your family members or friends, leave your phone out of sight. Make a rule saying at dinner time, no phones.
Yep.
Or whatever, When spending time with your family members or friends or when you're at church, leave your phone in a drawer or in your car or simply power it off. At strategic moments in life, digitally detox your life and recalibrate your ultimate priorities. Step away from social media for frequent strategic stoppages each morning, digital Sabbaths, 1 day offline each week, and digital sabbaticals, two-week stoppages each year. So some helpful thoughts on how we can monitor and assess how we're being shaped by our phones. So in sum, what all this is about, the book and the different things we've been talking about here is that technology shapes us. Our smartphones are a very powerful technology that is shaping us whether you like it or not. And so it behooves us to ask some tough questions and assess, how is this shaping me? Because the ultimate aim and the ultimate goal of my life, right, is to love God with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love people, and to love my neighbor as myself. And if my phone is shaping my ability to do that, boy, oh boy, I've got to take heed and do some good work to counteract that. Amen?
Amen.
All right. All right, until next time, this is from the pastor's bookshelf. See you with our next book.